So that's where we left it last week, and this week we're moving on now to a little later in history, and I want to focus primarily on what's called the Protestant Reformation and the Puritan movement, which covers a period of time beginning at about 1500 going down to about 1700, and that, of course, is in particular to begin tracing those great heritages that contributed to the formation of the constitutional documents in this country, which is, of course, what we're really all about in terms of this class. So with that much of a brief introduction, let's have a word of prayer and we'll get underway. Father, again, we give you thanks for the opportunity of gathering together here with your people. We pray that as we seek a deeper understanding of these matters that touch our lives and how we live them in our society, in this country that owes so much to your providence and your goodness, we just pray that our consideration of these things would serve to equip us, not only as Christians, but as citizens, to rise to the task to which you've called us in a way that will honor you and will be for the good of those people with whom we deal day by day, and this country and our children, and just ask that this would be a contributing factor to make us better people, to strengthen our faith and to lift us up in a deeper and richer understanding of your grace. We give you thanks for it in the name of Christ. Amen. When we think of the Reformation, it's really impossible to have any appreciation, I suppose, of what it is really all about unless we see it at least to some degree against the backdrop out of which the Reformation takes place, which is largely traced down through the Middle Ages. Last week we looked at this notion of law and really tried to think a little bit about what is law, and the next issue that I want to have in the back of your minds, keeping an eye on this as we press forward, is the whole question of the relationship between church and state. Those two institutions. That becomes sort of the next step in our logic. So we don't want to forget what we had before, but we want to press on into this new question. And to illustrate that, let's just think about the Middle Ages for a period of time. The Middle Ages, of course, is a very complex period of Western history, and my summary treatment of it right now is going to be at best in very broad strokes and in some ways inaccurate just because it has to be so generalized. But just for purposes of talking, let's think of the Middle Ages, or more broadly speaking, this whole period from the early Christian down to the Reformation in three broad movements. The first of these movements would be roughly from the years 100 down to about 300. And you liked my overhead so much last week that I really worked on it this week, and you're going to be real excited, I'm sure. This is an attempt, anyway, to try to give you just an image concerning what we have in mind when we think of the early Christian period. By this I mean 100 to 300, basically that period of time in which the state sort of stands in an overarching relationship to the church. The church is, at best, in a subservient posture. It is a minority. It has no status, no particular dignity for the most part, and in many cases is a persecuted minority. Now, the people who were adherents to the early church tended to give primary loyalty to Christ, and that's what got them into trouble. One of the formula that was supposed to be articulated by the citizenry in that early period of time was a little formula that said, Kaiser Kyrios, which means Caesar is Lord. And it was a way of giving expression to the notion of Caesar worship. And Christians, while they were willing to pay their taxes and drive the speed limit and bend over backwards to be model citizens at every conceivable point, were not prepared to say Kaiser Kyrios. And they would respond politely, Jesu ho Kyrios, you see. Jesus is Lord. Caesar will respect you, will obey your laws, we will not worship you. That's where we draw the line. And this was the kind of qualified allegiance that was given to the state in that early period of time. There's no official relationship, obviously, between the church and the state, but rather this kind of tension that occurred. That changed rather dramatically in the year 323, when Constantine came to the throne, declared that the official religion of the Roman Empire was Christianity. Whatever was in Constantine's heart remains a mystery. What he did was probably an act of political expediency, because Christianity by that time had become so forceful, such a powerful force to be reckoned with, that really it could no longer be ignored. And thus, from Constantine's time forward, we find the Christian church enjoying an official status. But unfortunately, it was at a time when the power of Rome was on the decline, and it wasn't much longer before, maybe a couple of hundred years, before the Roman Colossus had really collapsed from within and was overrun pretty much by barbarian tribes and so on that were on the periphery, you see, of the Roman Empire. And so the Roman Empire ceased to have a strong centralizing governmental program and became a very decentralized, kind of far-flung expanse of private little kingdoms and domains in which people were engaged in all sorts of disputes with one another, and we just call that generally by the term feudalism. But there was, interestingly, a great centralizing force that arose in the middle of this feudal environment. But it wasn't a political force, it was an ecclesiastical force. And so more or less out of the ruins of political Rome rose a new force, which was ecclesiastical Rome, in the form of the Roman Catholic Church, which served a very significantly positive service. I want to say that loudly and aggressively at this point, because most of us here are probably from a Protestant tradition and sometimes view with suspicion, you see, all things Roman Catholic. And at this point, I think we have to recognize that the Roman Catholic Church performed a great service in Western history that is oftentimes caricatured tragically. And this is called sometimes the Dark Ages and all kinds of terms that seem to suggest a very negative state of affairs. But think about what the church did. It was the Roman Catholic Church that came to the scene protecting learning, protecting culture, protecting art. It was the monasteries, it was the people of the church, you see, that were preserving everything that had been lost with the collapse of the Roman world. It was in the church that we find all of these great values were perpetuated. There were things that were, probably not as good as they could have been, but that's true of any time in history. The point is it was, if anything, probably better than things had been under Roman rule, in which over half the population were slaves, and we find all kinds of dehumanizing kinds of things going on. This may have been a step in the right direction, these Dark Ages. And so while we look back on that and maybe tend to be critical of it, if we see it from the point of view of the time itself, I think we have to recognize some positive aspects. So the way I'd characterize that period would be state/church, in which now the church and the state are in a kind of parity relationship. But the thing you need to note about it is there's no clear distinctions anymore. That some of the most important political figures in the world are church people. Ecclesiastical officials take on political responsibility, and there's an intermingling, as it were, of the church and the state in a way that reduces, politically at least, to a kind of institution where you can't really distinguish the two. That the church and the state become virtually the same institution in this feudal environment. Some of the most important political figures, you see, became the parish priest and other ecclesiastical officials. Well, by the late Middle Ages, things changed again, because the church, which had served a great salutary purpose, began to consolidate increasing amounts of power. So that by the late Middle Ages, we really have something, and I'll suggest to you this way, in which the church now has actually assumed the role that the state had enjoyed early on. And now it's the church, in a sense, that has gained the position of ascendancy. And the church has begun to consolidate power in many different areas of life. Political power, for example, in which we find that ecclesiastical officials often held very high governmental posts in various countries of Western Europe and England. The church had great political and commercial power. in which we find a vast amount of money was flowing into the coffers of Rome, you see. Vast amounts of the world's goods were flowing into Rome, and the church had a way of extracting money from countries through the power of what's called the interdict and other kinds of ecclesiastical taxation that really contributed heavily to the wealth of the church, but at the same time contributed rather heavily to the poverty, at least of some of the countries, particularly Germany, which was heavily impoverished in many ways by the influence of the church. That's part of the reason that Germany was really prepared to be very sympathetically disposed to a fellow like Martin Luther. The church also was able to consolidate a great deal of military power. This was largely through the Crusades, in which you have the Pope fielding an army, you see, which may seem to us in the 20th century a rather strange kind of arrangement where we have a great ecclesiastical figure with an army, you see, but that's exactly what was happening. And these military crusades that were carried on ostensibly to recover the Holy Land were really in many ways just a way for the church to become a military force to be reckoned with in the world. And the church, of course, was also a great intellectual power. The centers of learning were owned by and run by the church. The point I'm getting at is that the church had a kind of monopoly on all things that were of any value. And really, the political leadership of the world had to jump when the church said jump, you see. The church had immense power. But along with this power came a great deal of corruption. So that by this period of time, we find that the church had really in many ways lost its central mission, and it provoked a great deal of reforming efforts at that time. There are these so-called pre-Reformation reformers, figures like Savonarola, for example, who came to Florence during the Renaissance and carried on a running debate with the Medici family. You may recall that from your studies of the Renaissance. And other figures who came, John Huss, you see, in Bohemia, John Wycliffe in England, and others who came on the scene, some of the mystics, even Francis of Assisi in some ways could be interpreted as a reformer of sorts, who were calling the church back to a kind of spiritual vision to try to escape from the corruption that had come with all of the wealth that the church was enjoying by that time. But it really wasn't until Martin Luther that the Reformation as such took any kind of meaningful shape. Luther, of course, was a complicated figure, and it'd be fascinating to look at him, but for the purposes of time, I'm just going to reduce what I want to say to him to about 2 or 3 propositions. Luther, who was, of course, living in Germany and had grown up seeing what he perceived to be the negative consequences of the papal system and the entrenched powers of the church, was really probably thoroughly disenfranchised when he traveled to Rome on one occasion, a point where he thought he would have a great spiritual lift, you see, and saw what he perceived to be an abysmal situation of complete corruption, and that so disillusioned him that as he continued his work as an Augustinian monk, he began to search more and more deeply for a resolution to this conflict that plagued him, and as a result came to this conviction based on his study of the Scriptures that people are justified by faith alone. That's the theological tenet that really was the battle cry, you might say, of the Reformation. We're not focusing on the theology of it so much this evening, but on the political ramifications of that. What does it mean to say a person is justified by faith alone? Well, in part, that was a protest against the Roman Catholic doctrine of justification by faith plus works, particularly sacramental works. It was like a declaration of independence, as it were. Moderate, to be sure. Luther's not an extremist, not nearly as much as some that came after him, but he's putting a little distance. He's saying that people can come to faith, and that they can come to faith, they can come to Christ, they can come to a relationship with God through faith alone. And that evangelical message puts a little distance, you see, between the Christian and the sacrament. Not that the sacrament becomes unimportant, but becomes slightly less important as opposed to the message of the gospel. You see that. There's also in Luther this slightly individualistic character. Remember what Luther says of the Diet of Worms. He's standing there before the colossus of the church, this great prestige gathering of leadership in the church, and he's being commanded to recant and deny this material. And Luther makes his very famous little speech. He says, unless I am convinced by sacred scripture or evident reason, I cannot recant. But what I want you to note here is the word I. You see, the church would say to Luther, what do you mean, you, Martin? Who do you think you are? Doesn't Holy Mother Church tell you what to believe? What do you mean unless you are convinced? Why do we have to convince you of anything? What's this evident reason business? We tell you dogmatically what you're supposed to believe, and you accept it as a matter of fides implicitum. It's just a matter, you accept it on implicit faith. What's this business about convincing you of anything? But Luther was expressing an idea of private conscience. I've got to be convinced. That's individualism as opposed to collectivism, you see. Now again, in Luther, it's only a small step. He's not a radical, as he's often caricatured in history, but he's taking a step in that direction, and that provides something of the theological and philosophical base for what was to become, what was to take shape as the Reformation. Interestingly, Luther does not give us a thoroughgoing political philosophy. Throughout his life, he lived under the protection of Duke Frederick, Elector of Saxony, which was a political figure, and Luther all his life enjoyed that political protection, and he wasn't about to start articulating political philosophies that would threaten his comfortable relationship with Frederick. So he kind of left that one alone. But the next generation, particularly John Calvin in Geneva, was prepared to be somewhat more definitive in working out a political philosophy. And I'd like to just focus for a few minutes with you on Calvin and try to give you some sense in a very brief kind of way of the salient features of Calvin's political philosophy. Now, obviously, most people think of Calvin in terms of theology, and he's to be remembered, of course, as a great theologian, a great thinker. Many don't realize that Calvin did a vast amount of work in political science and hammered out a very well thought through political theory. What's interesting about this, of course, is that that political theory of Calvin's was picked up wholesale by the Puritans and imported to this country in the New England and Plymouth colonies. And so we are the heirs in America, almost you can almost draw a straight line between some of the fundamental tenets that were established in the early years of this country in the colonial period and the political philosophy of John Calvin. We are much more heavily influenced as a country by Calvin than virtually anyone wants to admit to or even is recognized. But I think it's something that helps us understand where we've been coming from as a nation, you see, for the last couple of hundred years. So let's just think about Calvin for a moment, particularly at the point of his political philosophy. Calvin saw a fault in every one of the three diagrams I've just showed you. He saw a problem with the state having ascendancy over the church. He saw a problem with the church having ascendancy over the state. He saw a problem with the church and the state intermingled. You think to yourself, well, what's left? It seems to cover the waterfront. Well, Calvin found one more possible scheme, and he articulated it this way: that there should be, as between the state and the church, a distinction. That's the word, a distinction. Now I'm going to give you my final little diagram here to try to illustrate this point. The word distinction is key. We hear in our culture the phrase separation of church and state. Anytime you hear someone say that, you should tip your hat to John Calvin. That's Calvin. Now, Calvin talked about a distinction of church and state, not a separation. But the basic concept that we have the church and the state, and that we distinguish them, originated, really, in the mind of Calvin. And he put it together, trying to avoid what he perceived as two great distortions. One of the distortions was the distortion of confusion. When the state and the church are confused, then there's no clear delineation of responsibility. there's too much susceptibility to corruption. The church becomes too vulnerable and loses her God-appointed responsibility to critique the state. You see, if the church is the state, then how can the church critique the state? So Calvin wants to avoid that. That's no good. A confusion of church and state will never do. But he also wants to avoid another extreme on the other end of the spectrum, which could be called a radical separation of church and state, in which the church becomes, in a sense, an illegitimate institution at the point of providing any critique. Maybe the best example of this would be some of the movements that came later in the Reformation, in the Anabaptist tradition. We would see something like this, for example, in contemporary Amish communities and so on, where the community, the church, essentially has a complete and total autonomy, utterly unrelated to the state. No involvement whatsoever. Complete and total separation. Paying taxes, you see, not living in disobedience, to be sure, but not attempting in any meaningful sense to participate in the life of the state. That would be too much of a distance. So Calvin sees two problems. Confusion on the one hand, separation on the other, and he calls for distinction, a distinction of church and state. The way this is understood in Calvin's political thought is as a division of labor. And this is critical. If you look at my little diagram here, you'll see the same vertical line that we were musing over last week. And above that line, we have the same, and below the line, we have the same distinction that we were talking about last week between Plato's ideal world and the receptacle world, the distinction between God and creation, the distinction between the supernatural and the natural, all of those distinctions that we looked at that time. Well, this is the same set of distinctions. Here we have God, and what I want you to note then are the two lines which reach down into this world. It's God who is in the transcendent supernatural category, reaching down below the line into this world with two different arms, as it were. That is, two different extensions of his authority. A right hand and a left hand is the imagery. So God reaches into this world, displaying and implementing his power and his rule with his left hand through the state and with his right hand through the church. That's Calvin's image. God reaching down, two institutions, a division of labor, not an antagonism between them, but certainly a distinction at the point of what they are appointed to do, you see. Well, what is the difference in this division of labor? Essentially, it's this. The state is appointed the task of watching over people's bodies, while the church is called to watch over their souls. In a very simplistic kind of way, you might say it that way. Another way of getting at it would be to say that the state sets minimum standards for behavior. The church calls people to optimum standards. The state says you can get this close to bad things and no closer. You can drive your car this fast and no faster. You can be this bad and no worse, you see. It's kind of like kids, you know. The state treats us like kids. It says, here's the limit, and if you cross that line, you're going to pay a fine, or you're going to wind up in jail, or worse. And so the state says, here's the limit. That's the minimum standard for behavior. Nothing less than that is tolerated. The church is focused on optimum. What is the very best thing you can do? What are the heights of virtue to which you can rise? You say, what are the good works that you can perform? So the church is focused in an entirely different direction than the state. They both have legitimate assignments from God, but they're not the same assignment. Again, the state, you might say, implements law, while the church calls people to the potential of grace. Where does the state get its law? Law, for the state, comes, as we were hammering away last week, comes from its roots in the ontological reality of God. The state does not invent its law autonomously, simply based on what seems expedient at the time, but the state has the duty to make sure the laws that are implemented here are consistent with the law of God that is rooted in His character. So the state has no business passing laws that are inconsistent with the justice and the holiness and the glory of God. That's a test that the state is required to apply to the laws that it passes. All right. Somewhat more specifically then, in the couple of minutes before our break, the duties of the state. I'd like to reduce this to a threefold analysis. Three things that are the duty of the state. The first of them, which is the primary duty of the state, according to Calvin, interestingly, is the preservation of human life. That's the fundamental duty of the state, to preserve human life. Thomas Jefferson said, quote, "The preservation of human life is the first and most basic duty of civil government." And at that point, Jefferson was a Calvinist. That is the fundamental duty. Now, how is the duty of the state to preserve human life implemented? What is its method? The method of the state is it preserves life by restraining evil. In other words, Calvin took seriously that we all have an amazing capacity for evil, and that evil is destructive. Give us a chance, we destroy each other. And if the state has the fundamental duty to preserve human life, then the fundamental method by which it does so is restraining evil, you see, and imposing order. Now, we ought to be orderly anyway. We shouldn't need someone making us behave ourselves, but the state is there to make sure we do behave ourselves if we're inclined not to. And the reason is in order to preserve us and preserve human life and keep us from self-destructing. Because our natural inclination, if anarchy runs rampant, is we wipe ourselves out and snuff out life indiscriminately, you see. What's the means whereby the state implements this duty of preserving human life? Calvin says it's the power of the sword. That is the power of coercion. The state has, but not the church, the state has the power to wield the sword. That's a classical way of referring, of course, to the coercive powers, and it's taken from Paul's comment in Romans chapter 13. The power of the sword can be wielded, so says Calvin, internally, and that's the power to punish crime, up to and including capital punishment, and the power of the sword externally, which is the power to wage what is called the just war. Calvin does not countenance war for the purpose of exploitation or gratuitous conquest. But Calvin does recognize that when there is a known evil or when there is a threat to the population, the state has the duty to rise in defense and wage the just defensive war. And that's the power of the sword waged externally. What's the business of the church? We said that the primary duty of the state is to preserve human life. What's the primary duty of the church? Well, this we find essentially, at least in simple terms, in what's called the 4 marks of the church that were, again, part of the Reformation understanding of the church. But I want to concentrate on the first 2 of these. The first mark of the church, or the first duty of the church, according to the Reformed thinkers, and in particular Calvin, the first duty of the church is to preach the Word. In the narrow sense, to preach the Word means to preach the gospel. To articulate the message of Christ and the meaning of who He is, and to call people to put their faith in Him and receive the benefits thereof. That's the gospel in the narrow sense. Very importantly, there is a sense in which the gospel is preached both in a narrow sense and in a broad sense. The broad sense of preaching the Word is this, that the church has the duty, and mind you, it's the church has the duty, to not just preach the gospel, but to provide the literate context within which the gospel can be rightly understood, which simply means to educate people. The church is called to give people education, chiefly so they can read the Bible, but more than that, so that they can become people that make a meaningful contribution in their society, so that they're not just hanging on, social parasites, so that they can actually make a contribution that's more significant than they possibly could without education. Calvin is not remembered for something that, and I think this is a tragic oversight, but Calvin came up with an absolutely novel idea, something that had never even been dreamt of in the history of Western thought. And it was this. Just notice how radical this idea is. Calvin came up with the idea that everybody, if they want it, should have the opportunity to be educated, even if they can't afford it, and that the church should pick up the tab. In the United States, we have what we call public schools. The whole concept of a public school owes its original invention to the mind of John Calvin, who created in Geneva what were called common schools, sponsored by the church, open to anybody. And the idea was that anyone who wanted an education was free to have one through that institution. But please keep in mind, Calvin's saying that's the duty of the church, you see, to educate. The second mark of the church is the sacrament. The sacrament represents, in the narrow sense, of course, the administration of what are called the sacraments of the church, which at least in Reformed tradition have been two sacraments, baptism and the Lord's Supper, and that represents the narrow sense. But again, there's a broad sense to the sacramental ministry of the church, because just as the preaching of the Word speaks to people's minds, that is, their inner persons, the sacrament is tactile, it's tangible, it's palpable, it's material, and it touches the material side of life and stands for the responsibility of the church to minister to people's bodies. And so in the broad sense, the ministry of the sacrament is the responsibility to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to provide for the bodily needs of people, you see. And that becomes part of the sacramental duty of the church. And so Calvin is saying that the church has both a duty to people's minds and a duty to their bodies, and that's the responsibility of the church. The other two I'll just mention to you without commenting on them, that the other marks of the church were a proper governmental structure and the proper exercise of discipline. Just leave you with this thought and then we'll take the break. I want you to notice what is conspicuous for its absence from Calvin's analysis of the responsibility of the state. We talked about the state preserving human life, etc. What's conspicuous by its absence is that the state is not, in Calvin, any kind of instrument of redemption. The state is not the institution which is assigned the task of providing social welfare, of providing people with food to eat, with clothing to wear, teaching them, caring for them, educating them. That's not the duty of the state. Watching over people from the cradle to the grave and making sure that everything that they could possibly need is provided for them automatically by a governmental agency. That is not the duty of the state. It is the duty of the church to provide for people's needs. But Calvin was very restricted in what he understood the nature of the state and the responsibility of the state to be. Namely, that it's there to impose an orderliness in society that really permits the church to do her great service. All right. Right after the break, then, we'll look at how that theory was carried by the Puritans through England and into the New World.